They see me, they wanna be me. I am the fantasy.
The purpose of this video is to analyze walking under two different conditions, walking in sneakers and walking in heels. For this task, we are comparing a male subject who exercises regularly and a female subject who is familiar with wearing heels. To start, there are two primary phases of gait, the stance phase and the swing phase. There are 5 motions that make up the stance portion of gait: heel strike, foot flat, mid stance, heel off, and toe off. And there are 2 motions that make up the swing portion of gait: initial swing and terminal swing. First, we analyzed gait with sneakers, then looked at the differences occurring at each motion during gait while wearing heels. Let's start by looking at what is happening at each motion during gait in sneakers.
Walk. Now walk.
Starting with the stance phase, we first begin with the heel strike and foot flat motions. Between the two, there is a concentric extension of the hip, eccentric extension of the knee, and eccentric dorsiflexion at the ankle. After the foot flat motion, we move into the mid stance and heel off motions. Here we see an eccentric extension of the hip, eccentric flexion of the knee, and concentric plantar flexion at the ankle. From the heel off motion to the toe off motion, there is a concentric flexion at the hip, concentric flexion at the knee, and concentric plantar flexion at the ankle. Moving on to the swing phase, for the initial swing motion, we see concentric flexion at the hip, eccentric flexion at the knee, and concentric dorsiflexion at the ankle, compared to the terminal swing phase where there is eccentric flexion at the hip, eccentric flexion at the knee, and concentric dorsiflexion at the ankle. Now let's look at the differences in these motions between the two subjects when walking in heels. For the heel strike motion, we can see the male subject has limited knee extension, a smaller stride, and a wider stance. During the foot flat motion, the female subject shows greater knee extension compared to the male subject, who additionally shows less dorsiflexion in this position. In the mid-stance motion, the female subject achieves more hip extension and plantar flexion than the male, and in the heel-off phase, the female also shows a longer stride length and a more narrow base of support compared to the male. For the last motion of the stance phase, the toe-off motion reveals increased plantar flexion and a longer stride in the female. In terms of the swing phase, we can see that during the initial swing motion, the male has an almost diminished stride length and increased dorsiflexion. And in the terminal swing motion, the male has greater knee flexion, a wider base of support, and ultimately spent less time in the swing phase compared to the stance phase and that of the female. As far as the female goes, there are minimal differences between sneakers and heels. However, the male subject shows many differences, including a decreased step length and speed, wider base of support, lowered center of gravity, an inability to reach full knee extension, and he utilizes knee flexion to raise his foot off of the ground instead of dorsiflexing. Ultimately, the male subject showed a greater variability in his gait when wearing the heels compared to the sneakers.
You gotta stretch.